April, 1942, RAF Tempsford, Bedfordshire. The rain came down in fine needles, turning the airstrip into a mirror of scattered lights. Inside a drafty hangar, a group of engineers from the Telecommunications Research Establishment, known simply as TRE, unveiled something that looked too small, too plain, to matter in a world at war. Two metal boxes, each no larger than a field radio, sat on a trestle table beneath a canvas tarp. The men called them Rebecca and Eureka. Rebecca was the airborne half, a compact interrogator that could fit inside a bomber or transport aircraft. Eureka was the ground beacon, a portable transmitter that could be buried, hidden, or carried by a two-man team. Together, they promised a miracle: navigation without speech, accuracy without light, direction without maps. The audience that morning included officers from the Royal Air Force, staff from the fledgling airborne forces, and two representatives from the Special Operations Executive, the shadow branch tasked with supporting resistance movements in occupied Europe. What the engineers described sounded more like magic than engineering. Eureka would be planted behind enemy lines. Rebecca, circling above, would send out a coded pulse. The beacon would reply in kind, a brief whisper of energy that revealed distance and bearing. The display in the cockpit would show the pilot precisely where to go without a single word spoken, without a single lamp flashed. The room was silent for a long moment. Then an RAF signals officer broke it with a low laugh. "You are proposing," he said, "to drop an active radio beacon behind German lines." His voice carried the weight of disbelief. "You might as well send an engraved invitation to the Gestapo." The engineers explained that it was not a broadcast in the ordinary sense. The beacon did not shout, it whispered. It did not transmit constantly, only in response to a query. The exchange lasted fractions of a second, a pulse, so brief and at such high frequency that enemy direction-finding equipment would struggle even to notice it. The officer remained unmoved. "If you light a candle in the dark, gentlemen, the enemy will see it long before your friends do. This will get men killed." His verdict was echoed by the RAF Signals Board a few weeks later. Their written opinion declared the system tactically unsound for airborne or clandestine use, warning that the operation of any such beacon behind enemy lines will, with certainty, compromise said personnel and invite their destruction. It might have ended there, a clever experiment filed away under rejected proposals. But sitting in the back of the hangar that day were the two men from SOE. They had come not to judge the invention, but to beg for anything that might save the lives of their agents in France. Since 1941, the SOE had been sending men and women into occupied territory to organize sabotage, supply the maquis, and gather intelligence. Their aircrews flew at night, in blackout, over landscapes stripped of landmarks. They searched for 3 flickering torches in a field, or the faint glow of a coded signal lamp. Too often, they never found it. Containers of weapons landed in rivers or towns, couriers broke legs in fields they had misjudged, and every searchlight that swung upward meant another aircraft lost. The SOE men saw in Rebecca and Eureka not a hazard but salvation. "They are already dying," one of them said quietly, "without it." That simple sentence saved the project. The RAF agreed grudgingly that SOE could continue limited experiments. The system was cleared for clandestine work only, never for military-scale operations. It was recorded in the minutes that the device was unsuitable for airborne assault owing to the risk of compromise on brigade scale. It was a bureaucratic reprieve disguised as a rejection, because nobody in the room, in that spring of 1942, imagined that one day entire divisions would depend on a radio beacon to find a French field in darkness. Airborne warfare itself was still an infant idea. Britain had a single airborne brigade, the Americans, none in combat. The thought of scattering thousands of paratroopers across enemy territory seemed fantasy. So the engineers packed their prototypes and left Tempsford. The colonel who had warned against them signed the final memo. Project retained for SOE experimental use only. Within weeks, the experimental use began. That summer, The first Eurekas were parachuted into France with small resistance teams. The first Rebecas flew in Whitley bombers on moonless nights. Pilots who once circled helplessly for half an hour searching for signal lamps now reported something astonishing. They followed the steady swing of a needle on a small indicator and dropped their cargoes within a few hundred yards of target. In a clandestine report filed in August 1942, one pilot wrote, "Contacted beacon at 0223, no lights visible, dropped at 0227. Containers received by party in full, no compromise detected." No German direction-finding vans appeared. No trap was sprung. The feared beacon betrayed no one. At Malvern, the TRE engineers refined their design. They adjusted the pulse codes, improved battery life, and hardened the circuitry for field use. By autumn, the sets could operate for 8 hours continuously or a full night on intermittent duty. The field kit weighed just over 30 pounds, light enough for a paratrooper or an SOE courier to carry with a rifle and a pack. They had proved the principle: silent navigation was possible. But official acceptance remained elusive. RAF planners clung to their doubts. A device that transmitted even for a second was still a risk. Airborne officers trained to rely on visual markers distrusted invisible ones. In meetings at the Air Ministry, the phrase "Rebecca, Eureka" became shorthand for bright ideas that looked suicidal on paper. Yet the field results spoke louder than the minutes of any committee. In North Africa, a handful of RAF and USAAF transport pilots borrowed sets for experimental use. Their reports mirrored the SOE experience. The beacons worked. Supply drops that once scattered across miles now fell within a single valley. Crews who had relied on shouted bearings now flew in silence, guided only by a flicker on an oscilloscope. The idea spread by rumour. "The box that whispers," air crews called it. By the winter of 1942, the Americans had taken notice. Technical officers from the U.S. Army Air Forces requested demonstrations. They saw the potential immediately not for 3 agents and a suitcase, but for 3,000 paratroopers and an invasion plan. And so, without fanfare, a device that the RAF had declared tactically unsound began its quiet migration across the Atlantic. American engineers stripped it down, redrew the circuits, and prepared it for mass production. On paper, Rebecca and Eureka remained an SOE oddity, too dangerous for brigade scale. In reality, the first components of D-Day's silent navigation system were already in flight cases bound for New York. The colonel's warning would linger like a ghost in the archives. "This will get men killed." He was half right. It would take men into the most dangerous hours of the war. But it would also bring thousands safely to the fields of Normandy because, in the end, it was not the loudest voice that led them home, but the quietest signal in the dark. By early 1943, the war had become a contest of logistics and precision as much as courage. Across the Mediterranean, from Tunisia to Sicily, transport crews and paratroopers fought not only the enemy, but also the night itself. Flying in blacked-out skies, they relied on maps that ended at the sea, dead reckoning, and guesswork that too often ended in disaster. When the Royal Air Force began quietly deploying the Rebecca and Eureka beacons for clandestine operations, those who witnessed their effect called it witchcraft. For the first time, aircraft could find a drop zone they could not see, no flares, no talking, just an invisible pulse between air and ground. The mathematics of silence had begun to replace the chaos of voice. American observers stationed with the British 8th Army saw the system at work during supply missions into the North African desert. They noted the absence of chatter over the radio net. Normally, crews filled the night with nervous talk, bearing corrections, wind reports, lost position calls, and questions shouted into static. But on these flights, the radio stayed quiet. Pilots spoke only when absolutely necessary. The beacons told them all they needed to know. "No words," one crewman wrote in his log, "and yet we knew exactly where we were." Silence had a measurable value. Each unnecessary transmission was a target for German direction finding. Each flare was a bullet magnet. The new British system reduced both risks to almost nothing. The aircraft spoke in coded pulses, impossible to translate, vanishing in a fraction of a second. They carried no distinctive accent, no Morse signature, nothing to betray their origin. By spring of that year, American technical officers began formal trials. In the Mediterranean theater, crews of the 12th Air Force experimented with the beacons during night transport operations. The results startled even the skeptics. The reports showed fuel consumption down by nearly a fifth and navigation error margins, shrinking from miles to mere hundreds of yards. In one mission summary from the Air Force Historical Research Agency archives, the comment line reads simply, "Accuracy astonishing. Recommend adoption." Meanwhile, the Germans noticed something they could not explain. Luftwaffe night fighters reported transports that flew directly to targets without search or signal. In their post-action analyses, they suspected traitors or invisible ground signals. They were partly right. The Allied planners in London took notice. At that moment, they faced the hardest truth of airborne warfare: dispersion killed. Every large-scale paratroop drop so far had scattered men across miles of countryside. In Sicily, in July 1943, American and British drops had turned into chaos. Men drowned in the sea, drowned in flooded fields, or landed in the wrong valleys. Commanders called it the geography of disaster. The problem was not courage, it was navigation. Paratroopers could train for every scenario except being lost before they hit the ground. The Rebecca and Eureka sets offered a way out of that nightmare. In London, IX Troop Carrier Command officers studied the device closely. To them, it was no longer an eccentric British invention but a potential cornerstone of invasion. They needed a system that would allow hundreds of aircraft to find their drop zones at night, in blackout, without speaking a word that German radio intelligence could overhear. A flight lieutenant who had witnessed the system's early tests told the Americans bluntly, "It works because it does not talk. It listens and answers. No confusion, no human error, no panic." That principle, listen and answer, became doctrine. It was the foundation of a new kind of communication. Interrogate, respond, vanish. By autumn, British factories at Malvern and Heston were turning out Eurekas by hand, each tested, sealed, and issued to specially trained Pathfinder teams. The Americans, impressed but wary of supply shortages, began to copy the design. Lockheed technicians adapted the airborne Rebecca units for the C-47 transport aircraft. Production orders flowed under Signal Corps supervision, and by the start of 1944, the United States had enough sets to equip nearly every plane designated for the coming invasion. The transformation was quiet but complete. What had begun as a rejected curiosity now occupied top-secret appendices of invasion plans. The same officers who once dismissed it as suicidal now called it indispensable. Behind the math of radio pulses lay a new psychology of war. Silence itself had become a weapon. Every reduction in voice chatter meant fewer bearings for the enemy, fewer warnings of what was to come. German listening posts that once buzzed with intercepted commands now heard only static. And through that static, the Allies would soon move unseen. The mathematicians of TRE, men who had studied electromagnetic wave behavior rather than infantry tactics, understood the irony. They had built a weapon not of sound but of absence. In an age of total war, where every noise could kill, their triumph was a whisper that carried armies. By December 1943, IX Troop Carrier Command concluded its report: system reliable. Accuracy within 100 yards under combat conditions. Recommend integration with Pathfinder program for forthcoming continental operation. That operation did not yet have a name, but everyone in the room knew what it meant. The invasion of Europe, whatever date the planners chose, wherever the beaches lay, would depend not only on courage but on calculation. The mathematics of silence would lead them there. In the winter of 1943, the rejected British beacon was reborn as an American secret. The engineers who took it apart at Wright Field described it as elegant simplicity, a ghost in a box. It spoke in numbers and light, not words, and it promised to lead thousands of men to invisible destinations. The device was divided into two halves. Rebecca, the airborne unit, sat in the aircraft's radio bay. It transmitted short pulses on a frequency around 230 megacycles high in the ultra-high frequency band, beyond the reach of most German intercept stations. Eureka, the ground unit, received those pulses and replied instantly with a coded signal of its own. In the cockpit, the pilot or navigator watched a small oscilloscope screen, two blips, one fixed, one moving. The spacing between them revealed range. When the blips merged, the aircraft was directly above the beacon. No talking, no visible light, just geometry written in electricity. The men at the telecommunications research establishment had designed it with field agents in mind, but now American and British airborne planners envisioned something larger. If small teams pathfinders could parachute into enemy territory before the main invasion, set up Eureka units, and switch them on, then hundreds of transport planes could home in silently. Each beacon would mark a landing or drop zone with mathematical precision. The technical manuals described the system in cold language, but the field kits told another story. A complete Eureka weighed just under 30 pounds, including batteries, tripod mast, and directional antenna. Packed in two canvas cases, it could be carried by two men. The batteries lasted about 12 hours, long enough for a night's work, but never longer than the operator's life expectancy if discovered. Alongside the radio sat a small thermite grenade and a single instruction sheet: destroy if capture is imminent. Testing began on the wide grass fields of Wiltshire and Dorset. C-47 aircraft fitted with Rebecca's flew at low altitude under blackout conditions, while engineers on the ground operated Eurekas from hidden positions. Even with fog and rain, contact could be made at distances of 10 to 20 miles, depending on altitude. The equipment performed beyond expectation. No searching, no orbiting, no chatter. One test pilot wrote in his notebook, "The box does the work." As production expanded, the British factories at Malvern and Worth-Matravers could not meet demand. American companies were ordered to manufacture compatible sets under the Signal Corps designation SCR 517, Rebecca, and SCR 518, Eureka. By February 1944, Lockheed and Western Electric were turning them out by the hundreds. Each was calibrated to the same frequency plan, ensuring that any Allied aircraft could home on any Allied beacon from Scotland to Sicily. But there was another challenge: security. The more sets built, the greater the risk that the enemy would learn how they worked. The solution was typical of wartime ingenuity. Each Eureka beacon operated on a pair of channels chosen at random before every mission. The codes were distributed in sealed envelopes, opened only during final briefing. If one set were captured, it could not guide the Germans to the next. In the underground workshops of the Royal Aircraft Establishment, technicians called the system the Ghost. It was there, but not there. It spoke in frequencies few could hear. It existed for hours, then vanished. To those who built it, it embodied the perfect paradox of war: to be seen by friends and invisible to foes. While the engineers refined the circuitry, the soldiers learned to trust it. The pathfinders of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions trained on English moors through the sleet and fog. They learned to jump with the Eurekas strapped between them, to assemble the tripod in the dark, to test the signal with pocket meters, and then to wait. When the needle steadied and the soft pulse replied, they would know that hundreds of planes were following that invisible thread to the spot where they stood. Their instructors told them the margin for error was less than 100 yards. The men called it the ghost compass. They joked that it was safer than a sergeant's directions. In private, many doubted it would work under fire. At IX Troop Carrier Command Headquarters, Colonel Donaldson summarized the balance of faith and fear. "It's one thing for a pilot to trust his instruments," he said, "and another for a man on the ground to trust that the sky will listen." By March 1944, that trust was the foundation of the invasion plan. Every C-47 designated for airborne operations over Normandy carried a Rebecca unit. Every Pathfinder team was issued a Eureka, tested and coded. When the hour came, the first allies to enter France would not be infantry or armor, but radio waves. The engineering of those ghosts had taken 2 years of secrecy, argument, and stubborn persistence. From the rain-soaked hangar at Tempsford to the laboratories at Malvern and the assembly lines in New Jersey, a rejected British design had become the quiet heart of an army. It did not roar like a tank or shine like a flare. It did not sing like a Spitfire's engine. It merely waited, listening for a call, ready to answer with the faintest whisper, a whisper strong enough to guide an invasion. June the 5th, 1944. Night settled over the English coast like a black curtain, drawn to hide the greatest armada in history. Along the airfields of southern England, the men of the Allied airborne divisions waited beside their aircraft, hundreds of C-47s lined wingtip to wingtip, their engines ticking in the dusk. To the infantry, the mission was simple: jump, seize bridges, destroy batteries, hold until relieved. To the engineers and radio men carrying the small canvas cases labelled Eureka, it was something different. They were not just soldiers, they were the first coordinates of invasion. The operation had begun 24 hours before D-Day. While the main assault was still secret even from many participants, the Pathfinder units of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions were already briefed on their impossible task. They would jump into Normandy ahead of the main force, in darkness, into country they had never seen, and light invisible beacons to guide the waves of aircraft that would follow. Each team carried 1 Eureka beacon, 1 backup battery, and 1 thermite grenade to destroy it if capture seemed certain. At 2200 hours, the first Pathfinder planes lifted from RAF North Witham. Pilots wore silk gloves to avoid static discharges. Radio silence was absolute. The navigators relied on their Rebecca scopes, searching for the brief whisper of test signals transmitted from ships anchored in the channel. Beyond that, they would depend on stars and faith. At 00:30, the first aircraft crossed the Cotentin Peninsula. Below them, German flak batteries came alive, spraying the night with red and white tracers. The transports shuddered under near misses, but they flew on. Inside, the Pathfinders braced themselves, hands gripping static lines. Each man carried 40 pounds of equipment, plus the precious radio beacon. They jumped, not knowing whether their landing fields were clear or mined, whether the French resistance would meet them, or whether the Germans were waiting. The first Eureka touched French soil near the hamlet of Sainte-Mère-Église at 01:15. The operators, Sergeant Charles Shea and Technician 4th Grade John Ray, dug the tripod into a hedgerow and connected the cables by touch. When they flicked the switch, the indicator lamp glowed dull green. The ghost had come alive. Rebecca-equipped aircraft miles away began to see the echo pulse on their scopes, a heartbeat in the dark that said, "This is France. This is the drop zone." In the command aircraft, Lieutenant Colonel Joel Crouch of IX Troop Carrier Command watched the oscilloscope flicker and steadied the plane onto its heading. "There it is," he told his co-pilot quietly. "That's our man." Over the next hour, more Eurekas came to life across the Norman countryside. Some teams landed miles off target, their beacons lost in marshes or captured. Others were destroyed by shellfire minutes after setup. But enough survived. Enough whispered back. The main waves of C-47s followed those signals through cloud and chaos. The result was not perfect, the airborne landings still scattered, but without the beacons, they would have been catastrophic. Later analysis by IX Troop Carrier Command revealed that drop accuracy around active Eureka beacons averaged within 300 yards, while zones without them saw dispersal of up to 3 miles. For men jumping into darkness, that difference was the line between a coherent attack and isolated survival. At headquarters in England, engineers from the Telecommunications Research Establishment monitored the invasion through coded radio traffic. Their system, once dismissed as tactically unsound, was now the unseen thread holding the operation together. Reports flooded in. Rebecca Eureka contact confirmed. Pathfinder beacon active. Troops on target. By dawn, The first light revealed gliders lying broken but functional on French fields. Near Sainte-Mère-Église, paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne had seized the town and were holding crossroads against German counterattack. In nearby fields, the still glowing Eurekas continued to pulse their invisible rhythm, marking the supply zones for the coming day. Pilots described the devices with awe. It was like flying on radar to a single man's heartbeat, one transport captain later said. For the Pathfinder teams, success came at terrible cost. Many were killed or captured before sunrise. At Lafayette Bridge, one beacon operator shot his way out of encirclement, carrying the still warm radio on his back. Another buried his set in a cow pasture and led his surviving men toward the sound of American gunfire. Yet their signals had done what no flare or lamp could: draw the invasion out of the sky and onto the right fields. General Dwight Eisenhower's staff received confirmation by 6 in the morning that the first airborne objectives were secured. A terse message read, "Pathfinders effective, beacons operating, airborne forces consolidated." In later briefings, Eisenhower himself acknowledged the role of the system. "Our airmen found their way home by means of those clever British boxes," he said, a faint smile breaking through exhaustion. Behind the battlefield statistics, the quiet miracle of Rebecca and Eureka lay in the physics of its restraint. It did not overwhelm the airwaves, it lived in brevity. A pulse lasting a few microseconds travelled from aircraft to ground and back again, carrying position without words, command without sound. It was the purest form of military communication ever invented. Question, answer, vanish. German intelligence officers, interrogated after the war, admitted they had detected mysterious radar-like signals during the early hours of D-Day but could not fix their origin. Their direction-finding vans, calibrated for longer transmissions, were blind to the flicker of the Eureka's response. The very quality that had once convinced British officers it would be suicidal had made it invisible instead. As the beachheads expanded and Allied reinforcements poured into France, Eurekas guided not only paratroopers but also supply drops, medical evacuations, and glider landings. Pilots spoke of chasing ghosts through clouds, knowing those ghosts were men with small radios and enormous courage. Weeks later, at a field near Carentan, a war correspondent saw a captured German officer staring at one of the recovered beacons. "You did all this?" the man said, shaking his head. "With that little thing?" Yes, they had. From its rejection at Tempsford to its triumph over Normandy, the Rebecca Eureka system had proved a lesson written in light and silence. The future of warfare would belong to those who spoke least, to the machines that whispered only when needed. When the war ended and the records were opened, a clerk at the Air Ministry reviewed the original memo from 1942 that had nearly buried the project. He added a final note in the margin, in pencil. This did not get men killed, it got them home. By late June of 1944, the beaches of Normandy were secure, but the war had only crossed its first threshold. The Allied armies, crowded along narrow lanes and hedgerows, needed a bridgehead not only of men and armour, but of communication, a way to direct reinforcements, drop supplies, and land gliders with surgical precision. What carried them forward was not always what the world could see. Beneath the roar of tanks and bombers, another war was being fought, a silent one, waged in pulses of radio light. In the ruins of French farmhouses and in apple orchards freshly scarred by shellfire, the Pathfinder's Eurekas continued to hum. Every night, C-47s and Dakotas roared in from England, guided by those invisible signals. To the naked eye, the skies were dark. To the men in the aircraft, the horizon glowed with ghostly echoes. The mathematics of Rebecca and Eureka had become the backbone of logistics. On June 24, 1944, the first large-scale resupply operation took place entirely under radio silence. 400 aircraft delivered ammunition, food and fuel to airborne divisions scattered through the Normandy countryside. Each drop was guided by a coded Eureka response. The pilots, many of whom had flown chaotic missions in Sicily and Italy, could hardly believe the precision. "We saw no flares, no lamps, no markers," one recalled. "Only the scope, and it told us everything. It was like the ground was talking to us." At Allied headquarters in Granville, the communications branch compiled data from the first 3 weeks of the invasion. Over 90% of airdropped cargo had landed within 150 yards of its intended target, a statistic unheard of in previous campaigns. The report, marked Top Secret Signals section, credited the improvement to consistent and effective deployment of Rebecca, Eureka equipment by airborne and supply units. But the system's most critical moment came not during the invasion itself, but in the days that followed. As Allied forces raced to close the Falaise pocket, the front shifted daily, drop zones changed hourly. It was impossible to rely on maps printed weeks earlier. The Eurekas became mobile markers of opportunity, carried by forward units who could call down resupply with mathematical precision. In one remarkable instance recorded by the Air Force Historical Research Agency, an isolated battalion of the 101st Airborne near Carouges ran out of ammunition during a German counterattack. Their radio was damaged, their signal flares soaked by rain. Only the Eureka remained functional. The operator, a corporal named Bill Everett, dragged the 30-pound set to an open field and switched it on, unsure if anyone could hear. 40 minutes later, a formation of American transport planes appeared out of the low clouds, homing on his invisible pulse. They dropped crates of ammunition directly into the defenders' perimeter. That night, Everett wrote in his pocket diary, "The ghost saved us." Meanwhile, British engineers back in Malvern continued refining the design. Their latest modification introduced a variable pulse delay, which made each beacon's reply unique and untraceable even to high-speed German receivers. It was the birth of what modern engineers would later call spread-spectrum communication, an innovation decades ahead of its time. In 1944, it was simply called scrambling. German countermeasures tried to respond. The Luftwaffe's radio intelligence units deployed listening vans across France, searching for the faint signatures of Allied navigation signals. They found none. "The signals are too brief and too weak," one captured technician told interrogators in 1945. "We could not catch them. They were there and then gone, like birds across the night." As the Allies advanced beyond the beaches, the Eurekas marched with them. They marked temporary airfields for casualty evacuation, guided night-flying bombers, and even directed gliders carrying heavy equipment. Engineers began calling the network of portable beacons the Invisible Bridge, a bridge that connected the skies of England to the fields of France without a single visible span. In August, during Operation Dragoon, the invasion of southern France, the same system was used to coordinate paratroop drops over Provence. American and Free French units reported near-perfect accuracy. The after-action report of the 517th Parachute Infantry Regiment included a single line of tribute. Rebecca, Eureka performance flawless. To those who worked in the shadows of radar and radio science, it was vindication beyond imagination. The same generals who had once written in official minutes that "this system will get men killed" were now requesting beacons faster than factories could build them. And yet, the engineers took little glory. Their war remained unrecorded in the headlines. They worked in sheds and bunkers, soldering wires and calibrating coils, their triumphs measured in milliseconds and miles. Theirs was a language of silence, one that had given flesh-and-blood soldiers the power to navigate a continent in the dark. In the autumn of 1944, when paratroopers dropped into Holland during Operation Market Garden, Rebecca and Eureka guided them again, now refined, more secure, more trusted. Even when the operation faltered on the ground, the airmen's navigation was flawless. The system that had been rejected in a Bedfordshire hangar 2 years earlier had become the unbreakable thread stitching together the vast tapestry of Allied movement. At war's end, as scientists prepared their reports for the post-war symposium on Allied communications, one engineer from the Telecommunications Research Establishment wrote a final summary paragraph that could have served as an epitaph for the entire enterprise. "It was not power that gave us victory, but precision." The device was built to speak for seconds, but in those seconds it changed the shape of war. Our invention was not loud, not glorious, but it was exact, and exactness, in the end, was what defeated chaos. The Rebecca, Eureka was quietly decommissioned after 1945, replaced by newer systems. Yet, its descendants lived on in radar transponders, in instrument landing systems, and in every aircraft that spoke silently to the ground beneath it. The invisible bridge, born of doubt and defiance, had carried an army across the Channel and into history. And in its pulse, that brief electric whisper between air and earth, the Allies had found not just their way, but their voice in silence. By the spring of 1945, the war in Europe was nearly over, but for the men and women who had built the Rebecca and Eureka, their work had only just begun to reveal its legacy. The secret that had carried paratroopers into France, guided gliders through fog, and delivered supplies into burning fields, was no longer just a military tool. It had become the foundation for a new kind of warfare, one that depended not on noise and spectacle, but on silence, precision, and the art of being unseen. At the Telecommunications Research Establishment in Malvern, the same facility where the rejected Curiosity had been born 3 years earlier, engineers now spoke of controlled invisibility. The term had nothing to do with cloaks or camouflage. It described the way a signal could exist, be transmitted, received, and vanish without leaving a trace that an enemy could detect. To them, this was the true revolution of Rebecca and Eureka. It was not the range or even the accuracy that mattered most. It was disappearance. Dr. Bernard Lovell, one of the young lay, radar scientists who had joined TRE in 1941, wrote in his notebook, "The beauty of this system is in its modesty. It does not shout its presence. It whispers and waits. That is the mathematics of survival." Lovell would later become one of the fathers of radio astronomy, but in those final months of war, his thoughts were on a different kind of cosmos, one filled not with stars, but with aircraft and echoes. The final European missions to use Rebecca and Eureka took place in April 1945, supporting Allied advances across the Rhine. By then, the system had been perfected into what engineers called the Mark III series, capable of variable pulse rates and encrypted timing sequences. American and British aircrews reported flawless operation even in dense jamming environments. German counter-radar units had given up entirely. The signals were too faint, too brief, too clever to catch. In one of the last recorded instances of its combat use, a British Pathfinder team dropped near the Wessel bridgehead under heavy anti-aircraft fire. Their Eureka set was damaged on landing, one antenna snapped in half. The operator, Sergeant Alfred "Alfie" Carr, improvised by binding the broken section with copper wire stripped from a field telephone cable. When he powered it on, the response pulse returned weak but steady. 2 hours later, the first gliders appeared overhead, guided precisely to the drop zone. After the war, Carr received no medal, no citation, only a note from his commanding officer. Signal received. Operation successful. The Rebecca-Eureka network had done more than guide planes. It had guided strategy. Its reliability allowed commanders to think differently about distance and timing. No longer did they need moonlight or visible landmarks. No longer did airborne operations depend entirely on weather or luck. It was a quiet transformation, a scientific one that reshaped how wars would be fought ever after Germany's surrender. Teams from the US. Army Signal Corps and the Royal Air Force assembled a classified report titled Combined Use of Portable Transponding Beacons in European Operations, 1943, 1945. The report, filed with the Air Ministry and later declassified by the National Archives, contained over 500 pages of data, diagrams, and combat evaluations. Buried in its introduction was a single understated line. The Rebecca-Eureka combination represents the first fully integrated system of tactical interrogation and response in modern warfare. Those words would echo for decades. Every later development in radar identification, friend or foe systems, and modern transponders owed its logic to that simple call and answer system, a conversation that lasted milliseconds but carried the weight of history. Across the Atlantic, at Lockheed's Burbank plant, engineers who had built the airborne Rebecca sets were reassigned to post-war aviation projects. Many of them moved into civil aviation, where the same principles of pulse reply became the heart of modern air traffic control. The whisper that had guided soldiers to freedom would now guide travelers through peacetime skies. But even as the engineers moved on, the men who had used the system in combat never forgot it. At the 1962 U.S.-Japanese Aviation History Symposium, an American veteran of the 339th Fighter Squadron was asked what piece of technology he trusted most during the war. He didn't mention the P-38's engines or its guns. He said simply, "That little box that answered when you called." Post-war interrogations of Japanese and German officers confirmed what Allied scientists had suspected all along. Neither Axis power had ever developed an equivalent. Japanese pilots, who fought in vast empty skies over the Pacific, relied on visual markers and radio bearings that were easily jammed. German radar scientists at Peenemünde had experimented with similar ideas, but they lacked the miniature vacuum tube technology that made Rebecca Eureka portable. What the British had achieved, a two-way radio dialogue in microseconds, undetectable to enemy receivers, was years ahead of its time. At the 1985 Pacific Theater Veterans Reunion in Honolulu, one Japanese officer who had been an air operations planner during the war met his American counterpart. When shown a surviving Eureka beacon in a museum display, he shook his head in disbelief. "We thought it was black magic," he said softly. "We thought you could see us through clouds." The American replied, "We couldn't see you at all. We just knew where to be." In a sense, that was the philosophy. The system had embodied knowledge without visibility, control without display. It was science made humble, and in its humility lay its strength. By the end of the war, over 5,000 Eureka beacons and 10,000 Rebecca units had been produced. They had flown with American, British, Canadian, and Free French forces across Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific. Of all those sets, fewer than 2% were ever lost to enemy detection. Today, the surviving examples sit in museums behind glass, unremarkable grey boxes with dials and switches. Visitors walk past them without understanding that these were the instruments that made D-Day possible, that guided thousands safely through darkness, that turned an ocean of chaos into a geometry of precision. The Rebecca Eureka system was born from skepticism, nurtured in secrecy, and perfected in silence. It was the first true voice of the modern battlefield, a voice that asked a single question, received its answer, and then disappeared. In the quiet halls of the Air Ministry after the war, one anonymous clerk summarized the lesson in a memo destined for storage and eventual obscurity. Victory was not only the triumph of strength, but of structure. Not only of courage, but of calculation. The machines that spoke in silence did more than win battles. They redefined the very sound of war. And thus, in the spring sunshine of peace, the mathematics of silence faded back into the background noise of history, still there, still waiting, invisible as ever. The war ended, but the silence it had taught the world did not. By 1946, Europe was rebuilding itself from ashes, and the engineers who had once calculated death by radio wave were calculating peace. Yet among the burned-out hangars and dismantled laboratories, one idea lingered. The Rebecca and Eureka system had not simply guided aircraft, it had guided an era. It had proven that precision, not power, was the final arbiter of victory. At Malvern, the former telecommunications research establishment was reborn as the Royal Radar Establishment. Its purpose was now scientific, not military. The young physicists who had spent the war crafting invisible bridges across the Channel were redirected towards civil aviation, meteorology, and communications. But when they walked the long, narrow corridors lined with grey metal racks and coiled cables, they could still hear the faint pulse of the system they had built. In a corner of Laboratory 4, An engineer named Joan Curran, who had once worked on radar countermeasures, found herself again studying the principles of pulse reply. Her post-war research into transponding signals would become the foundation for Identification Friend or Foe, IFF, Mark X, the direct descendant of Rebecca and Eureka. "Every pilot who returns safely," she wrote in a report dated 1947, "owes something to that little box that answered in the dark." In the United States, the legacy continued under a different name. The Signal Corps and the newly independent U.S. Air Force adopted the AN, APN, and AN-TPN beacon systems, which used the same mathematical logic interrogation, response, and timed disappearance. At Wright Field, a small team of scientists led by Dr. George Valley began adapting these principles to what they called precision approach radar, the system that would allow pilots to land blind in fog or storm. "Without the British beacon," Valley later said, "we would never have learned to trust a screen more than our eyes." The scientists of both nations, now allies not just in war but in discovery, began sharing data freely. Conferences, once held under the shadow of secrecy, were now open gatherings of engineers, physicists, and mathematicians. They spoke a new language, half technical, half philosophical. To them, Rebecca and Eureka had revealed something profound, that invisibility was not absence, but design. In 1948, the Royal Aircraft Establishment conducted the first post-war experiments using Rebecca, Eureka technology to guide civil aircraft into London Airport, what would later be known as Heathrow. The test pilots reported landings within 100 yards of the beacon centerline under zero visibility conditions. Civil aviation had found its compass in a wartime ghost. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the Cold War was beginning. The same principles that had once guided paratroopers to liberation were now guiding bombers across oceans. The Strategic Air Command adopted modified transponders derived directly from the Eureka architecture, allowing its aircraft to identify one another automatically even in radio silence. The irony was not lost on those who remembered the system's origin. A device once built to save lives on D-Day now helped maintain the uneasy peace of deterrence. At the National World War II Museum decades later, curator Michael Reynolds would describe it best. "Rebecca and Eureka were not weapons. They were the nerves of a nervous system that stretched across the sky. They made command and control possible in a world that had grown too fast for human senses." But in 1949, as Europe adjusted to peace, the scientists who had built the system faced a new kind of uncertainty. The laboratories were shrinking, the budgets disappearing. Many left for universities, where they taught physics to students who would never know what those equations had once done. The beacons were packed away into wooden crates and marked obsolete equipment for disposal. Still, the silence remained. The engineers had built something that refused to die because its logic had entered everything, from air traffic control to weather radar, from transponders in passenger planes to the instruments that guided the first experimental jets. The ghost they had created had become permanent. In 1962, at a joint Anglo-American symposium on wartime radar, Dr. Robert Hanbury Brown, one of the original Rebecca designers, was asked what he considered the greatest lesson of the war. He paused before answering. "That clarity," he said, "is not achieved by volume but by precision. The Germans built radios that shouted. We built one that whispered, and the whisper endured." The audience, a mix of soldiers and scientists, fell silent. They understood. The Rebecca, Eureka, was not just a technical achievement, it was a philosophy of communication, one that valued brevity, accuracy, and the profound strength of restraint. In the archives of the Air Ministry, one final memorandum closed the official file on the project. Dated June 10, 1950, and written in the neat, careful hand of a civil servant, it read, "The Rebecca, Eureka equipment is to be retired from active service. Replacement by improved radar beacons is complete. However, its principles remain valid and are to inform all future developments in transponding systems." Below the typewritten lines, "Someone unknown," Perhaps one of the old engineers had added a note in pencil, never truly silent, always listening. By the end of that decade, the original sets had vanished from use. Some were sold as surplus, others dismantled for parts, a few preserved quietly in museums. But their pulse lived on in the circuits of every aircraft transponder, every radar-guided approach, every satellite navigation link that would follow. For those who had once worked in the cold sheds of Bedfordshire or the echoing laboratories of Malvern, it was enough. They had seen how a whisper could carry an army. They had seen how silence could save lives. And as they aged into the peaceful years of the 1950s and 60s, they carried with them a memory not of explosions or victories, but of a faint green glow on a cathode ray screen, two blips converging, one fixed, one moving, until they met as one. That was the sound of precision. That was the sound of silence becoming strength. And though the world would forget the name Rebecca, Eureka, every time a pilot today flies through fog guided by unseen signals, the echo remains a ghost still answering across the ether. In the quiet years after 1950, the world's noise changed. Jet engines replaced propellers, television replaced radio, and the skies filled with machines faster and higher than anyone from wartime England could have imagined. Yet beneath that new thunder, one constant endured the logic of Rebecca and Eureka, the whisper that had once crossed the channel in secret. At first, its legacy lived in the margins of blueprints and research notes. Civil engineers at Heathrow and Orly used the same pulse timing equations to guide aircraft to runways through fog. Naval technicians adapted the transponding principle for ship identification across the North Atlantic. In America, engineers at Bell Laboratories used its paired signal design as a model for the first experimental air traffic control radar systems. Every time an aircraft blip appeared and a controller confirmed its identity, it was Rebecca and Eureka speaking again, no longer in war, but in peace. Yet the old veterans who had once carried the beacons through the fields of Normandy were beginning to fade away. In 1953, a reunion of the Royal Air Force's airborne engineers took place in a small hall in Bedfordshire. Among them was Flight Lieutenant Peter Sturges, one of the first to test the Eureka in combat. His speech, recorded on a crackling reel-to-reel, carried a note of pride tempered by humility. "We built a thing that was meant to vanish," he said. "And it did, but only from sight. The world is still following its signal." The truth of those words became clear as new generations of scientists carried the pulse forward. In 1958, the U.S. Federal Aviation Administration formally adopted secondary surveillance radar for national airspace, a direct descendant of the wartime beacon. Instead of a pilot's voice, aircraft now replied automatically when interrogated by ground radar, identifying themselves with a coded pulse. The Rebecca had become global. That same year, at the Royal Radar Establishment, British researchers were working on satellite tracking. They used pulse interrogation methods to measure the position of orbiting craft. The first signal received from an experimental British satellite used timing equations first written in 1943 for the Rebecca-Eureka pair. It was as if the voice of D-Day had been launched into orbit. The pattern repeated itself across continents. In the Soviet Union, engineers studying captured Allied radar components unknowingly reinvented the same concepts. By the early 1960s, their own friend or foe identification systems mirrored the principles first tested in the hedgerows of Normandy. The whisper had crossed borders as invisibly as it had crossed the Channel. Back in Britain, the men and women who had built the original system were quietly honoured in closed ceremonies. Their names seldom appeared in newspapers. Theirs had been a secret war, and now it was a secret legacy. When the Ministry of Supply issued a declassification notice in 1961, it contained a single clinical summary. Rebecca, Eureka operational utility demonstrated. Principles retained for future systems. But for those who had lived through it, those words barely touched the truth. The system had not only guided aircraft, it had guided the philosophy of a generation. It proved that invisibility could be more powerful than spectacle, that silence could hold command over chaos. The war had begun with noise, engines roaring, guns firing, commands shouted into microphones. It had ended with precision, a pilot staring at a green scope, trusting two merging blips to lead him home. At a post-war symposium in 1962, Dr. Alexander Lamb, who had overseen part of the telecommunications research establishment's radio navigation team, described it in almost poetic terms. Rebecca and Eureka were our first conversation with the invisible. We asked the air where we were, and it answered. It was a human act disguised as a mathematical one, a question and an answer that saved lives. By the late 1960s, every major commercial aircraft carried a transponder that pulsed back to interrogating radar with identification, altitude, and position exactly the dialogue first conceived in that Bedfordshire hangar 2 decades before. The whisper had become a heartbeat of global travel. Even as the Cold War darkened the skies again, the old beacon logic persisted. U.S. Strategic Air Command bombers flying under Arctic silence identified themselves to radar pickets through coded transponders, lineal descendants of Eureka. In Moscow, Soviet controllers used similar systems to monitor returning long-range patrols. The ghosts of Rebecca and Eureka were now keeping the peace by ensuring no one mistook a friend for a foe. When the men who had invented it grew old, many returned to their pre-war trades, teachers, instrument makers, farmers. But in the quiet of their later years, they sometimes spoke of the signal. One veteran, interviewed in 1978, said, "You could hear it through your bones, not a sound, but a feeling. You knew someone was out there, listening." And that, perhaps, was its truest legacy. It was not the hardware that endured the valves corroded, the cables frayed, but the principle that trust could exist through silence. The pulse between Rebecca and Eureka had been a promise. I am here. You are near. Keep coming. By the dawn of the jet age, that promise had become invisible infrastructure, the unseen language of aviation, the mathematics beneath every safe landing. It had outlived the war, the empire that birthed it, and the men who once doubted it. At the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum, a single Rebecca receiver rests beside a plaque. The inscription reads, "Developed by the British Telecommunications Research Establishment, 1942, used by Allied airborne forces on D-Day and thereafter. The first system of its kind, an invisible bridge of radio between earth and sky." Visitors walk past it quickly, unaware that the small grey box once held the code that opened Europe's gates. But if one listens closely, beyond the chatter of tourists and the hum of lights, one might almost hear the faint echo of a pulse, the whisper that once guided men through darkness and never truly stopped answering.